Hey everyone, I'm here with JC Pissarro for Public Health and Emergency Management. He was a college student in Rhode Island at the time that Hurricane Katrina hit, and we're just going to talk a little bit about his perception of the event and the government response afterwards. So my first question is just briefly, what was your experience of Katrina?
Sure. Thank you for having me here. Related to Katrina, I guess I was a college student at that time. I was going into my sophomore year, and it was interesting to see how quickly the storm went from a tropical storm to a to a massive hurricane, right? And and how little time the government had to react, and how little time people had to evacuate, which led to one of the worst catastrophes from natural disaster in our country's history.
Mm. And what was obviously you were far away, so I'm assuming you were hearing about this on the news. What were your sources that you were seeing, and what was the after the fact? Like, what were you seeing on the news? Like, how long did that news cycle last, and what were you seeing then?
Yeah, sure. Well, then when I was in college, social media wasn't a thing, right? So it was just your cable news channels cover it less and less over time, with
Mm.
periodic check-ins, um, just to show, hey, here's what happened, here's where they are, and how long it's going to take to really, I guess, recover. Which I don't
Mm.
think they still have not fully recovered.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you when you're looking back and you're thinking about that government response, or 19 years after the fact now, how do you feel about that? Like, what do you think that the government could have done differently?
Well, I don't know if the government. It's tough, right? So how the short period of time between when the storm went from a storm to a major Category 5 hurricane
Mhm.
was so small, right? So they certainly went through the proper channels of making sure that they declared state of emergency. I just don't think they had
Mhm.
enough time to act, right? So
Yeah.
it seems like they went from a, hey, we have to go through all these channels to get an approval before we can make a decision, instead of just going with the flow and kind of doing them um, at the same time in parallel.
Mm, definitely. That hurricanes are especially tricky because of that, the really fast turnaround. It like you said earlier about the tropical storm straight to the major Category 5 hurricane. And they did usually in United States emergency management, we follow a bottom up procedure, which is if the local level gets overwhelmed, then it's going to go to the state, and if the state is overwhelmed, they'll declare a state of emergency, and the federal government will step in through the Stafford Act. And they did originally follow that process. The problem was just when the damage was so severe, when everyone got to the affected areas, it was there was no coordination. It just became a confused implementation pattern. The federal government was trying to declare some things top down, and there was just zero coordination, which led to a lot of that media response and that backlash about that, because things weren't getting done and there just weren't enough resources ever.
Well, and it also doesn't help when the city floods and it's hard to actually
Mhm.
bring things in because you don't
Mhm.
have the necessary means of transportation to
Mhm.
bring things in when it's just completely flooded. And then, where everybody was sheltered in the Superdome, and how
Mhm.
that was inadequate because that was damaged, and they didn't have public enough purified water. They didn't have enough food or medicine. The electricity was out, so the food was spoiling. So it was just
Mhm.
the government at the time, right? I don't think this was an unprecedented storm.
Mhm.
There was nothing like it on record that the government had to reply or respond to in such a way, because
Yeah.
of all of the um, everything that kind of stacked on top of each other,
Mhm.
versus a hurricane that might hit Florida, where it's devastating, but it's not below sea level, so you're not flooding an entire city and uprooting hundreds of thousands of people's lives.
Mhm. Absolutely. I mean, a lot of the things you just talked about too, that ties in a lot to the different stages of emergency management and how this disaster just it showed that there were lapses in every single stage because that one that the first is the prevention or preparedness and like you talked about with the Superdome that there was no there was not a great plan in place to get people there and then its operation afterwards which shelters are a major part aspect of after like a disaster hits. And that also really that ties into public health of the things we were talking about, there not being enough food or clean water and the flooding, there was diseases, and the AC went out, it was humid. So people were just in this negative environment for so long because of that lack of preparedness. And then with the mitigation stage, you had the levees that failed and flooded the city because they weren't being upkept. And then the response stage, which had major problems because of the lack of communication. And that also, I mean, public health has a big role in this, even though we might not think of this as a public health disaster. There was a public health state of emergency that was declared because the main part of the response stage of emergency management is to preserve life. That's the number one goal, is to preserve human life. And people were dying, people were living in these horrible conditions for extended periods of times because the United States government was not prepared to really go through this entire process.
You know, what's evident about this is the government really used this in all divisions and all agencies within the government used Katrina and the response as a case study on how what not to do in the future. Because you can see that even now in recent hurricanes, how quickly the government is prepared to ship supplies in, to bring in public utility companies from other states and give funding to them to get everything back up running as quickly as possible versus waiting weeks and months to have some semblance of normalcy, which it took a long time in New Orleans for that to occur.
Yeah. Have you seen that that change? Is that something like change in government response that you've seen after Katrina? Is there anything else that you would say is changed in our either emotionally or physically just our reaction to disasters?
Well, I think there's a handful of parts that kind of come into play here, right? One, how the government kind of communicates when there is a national disaster, right? And two, there is 24-hour coverage whenever there's a major hurricane. I distinctly remember in 2022 when Ian came through, even though it hit a few hours south of where I am here in Tampa, it was just constant news coverage, and you saw how well prepared the government was, especially if you compare it to Katrina, and really the reactions of the individuals that lived there, how people were more willing to evacuate, even though you're not going to get everybody to. So I think not only the government, reacted and improved their process. I think it's mandatory evacuations are, I think, more well received, and actually people are more inclined to listen to them post Katrina than pre Katrina.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you so much for speaking to me today. It's great to hear about your perception of the events. I was 2 years old when Katrina hit, so I don't have any memory of it, and I've only been able to see the recent effects in Florida. But it's great to hear your perspective. So thank you.